Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
So yes, this is Alex Barata, about to interview Thabo Miles Medley from London Metropolitan University, talking about teacher recruitment and what more can be done in this regard now that we have a new government in place. First, though, let's hear from the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This week on Teachers Talk Radio News, the King's speech at the state opening of Parliament outlined Labour's legislative programme for the year ahead, with 32 bills, including an ambitious education bill, the provisions of which will come into effect in late 2025. These include extending the national curriculum to all schools, including free schools and trusts, a statutory requirement for a curriculum review, qualified teacher status for all teachers. Currently there are 17,000 teachers who are unqualified and working in schools. Multi-academy trusts to be inspected by Ofsted. A register of all children not in school. Breakfast clubs will become a legal requirement, and the cost of branded uniforms to be capped. Also this week in the news, many students, parents and teachers will be delighted to hear the news that the UCAS personal statement is to be abolished. Joe Saxon, Chief Executive of UCAS, announced that the end of the personal statement was to open doors of opportunity and encourage applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. Professor Lee Elliott Major, the Professor of Social Mobility, described this as a significant step to make admissions a little bit fairer. However, a number of critics pointed out that the UCAS personal statement is to be replaced by 3 questions, which almost exactly replicate the structure and content of the current UCAS personal statement. This week, All Saints Academy in Dunstable had lost its appeal to the High Court in its judicial review of its Ofsted inspection. 2 inspections, relatively close together in time, came to very different conclusions about the school. This led to them questioning the methodology and appealing for the criteria to be revealed. Mr. Justice Kavanagh, in his judgment against the school, indicated that all such judgments must contain a degree of subjectivity, and that the High Court was not the proper place to settle matters of public policy. These should be left to politicians. Some legal analysts, while agreeing overall with the role of the courts, have pointed out that, of course, this judgment itself contains a high degree of subjectivity. Labour's new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has announced that term-time holiday fines for absence from school are to continue. They are here to stay. She stated that parents should honour their responsibilities and recognise the importance of attendance in schools, and that it was necessary to have some deterrent and consequences. Parents groups have pointed out the cost savings of taking children on holiday in term time far outweigh the current fines, and that largely this remains a tax on poor families. In the school year 2022 to 23, permanent exclusions reached a record high, up 44% on the year before to 9,376. School suspensions were also up 36%. Beth Prescott, education lead at the Centre for Social Justice, said, "These are truly shocking figures, with both school exclusions and suspensions at new record highs, combined with a crisis in school absence with the so-called ghost children at near record levels. 1 in 5 kids persistently absent. There's a pressing and immediate emergency unfolding across our schools." This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. Thank you for listening.
And again, Thabo Miles Matley from London Metropolitan University is going to talk about teacher recruitment and what this might mean with regard to just having elected a new government. Hello, Thabo, are you there?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Thank you very much for being on the show and coming on to talk about this subject.
Yeah, it's quite exciting, and also kind of the technologist in me is quite interested by this whole platform. I didn't know that radio shows could be recorded this way, so it's very interesting.
Great. Well, just to start off with a broad question, if we're talking about teacher recruitment and what it might mean for the new government, and likewise how the new government might affect teacher recruitment, does that mean, obvious question, but does it mean that teacher recruitment is in trouble?
Yeah, I mean that's such a great question, and in order to answer it, I think you've kind of got to cast the net quite wide. We always talk about teacher recruitment as if it's in crisis, but music teachers, we've not run out of music teachers. We've not run out of PE teachers. Those recruitment numbers, considering that they have to self-finance their PGCE, those recruitment numbers are incredibly strong. So I think it depends on what you mean. And really the issue is in STEM, physics being the worst and computer science being most years a pretty close second worst. So is teacher recruitment in trouble? In certain subjects, it definitely is in trouble. But in other subjects, perhaps less so.
So can you explain to us then what the reasons might be for why teacher recruitment is strong in some subjects and weak in others?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a question that's made even more difficult by the fact that the bursary for computer science, say, is almost £30,000 tax free. So, and there is no bursary for PE, for example. So not only are certain subjects doing a lot worse than others, but even £30,000, or not quite £30,000 of tax-free money hasn't solved that problem. So why can we not get computer science teachers even when the opportunity is so generous? Yeah, like I said, it's a big question. I think I was talking with a colleague about this, and I was thinking back to the big recruitment pushes of kind of my lifetime. So I remember being watching the adverts on television for New Labour. So if you go back 20, 25 years, New Labour had a fairly big push on recruitment, and their whole approach was very much one of teaching is a good job, and they advertised the starting salary. There were golden hellos, upfront money to when you signed on with the school. And then I was part of another recruitment wave, which was Teach First, and that was very much more a kind of bring an end to educational inequality, and that was the story we were telling. So, kind of long story short, I think the problem with teacher recruitment right now is what's the story, right? In
Yeah.
order to get people to dedicate that, what is it's a big commitment, and we make a lot of sacrifices. In my last teaching role before I started training teachers, I used to get to my desk before 7 every day, and I would very seldom leave before 5:30.
Right.
Not all teachers work that hard, but it's not that's not and those aren't abnormal numbers. If you're going to get people to make that kind of sacrifice and that kind of commitment, I think you need to tell them a meaningful story, and I think that's where we've lost our way.
Thank you. That's a very interesting answer. And I mean, a lot of these questions, and certainly the answers, are going to be quite complex in some cases, not necessarily a yes or no. But thinking about this, and it is, I suppose, a loaded question, but do you feel that some teachers today, and this may have, of course, impact on recruitment, are perhaps afraid to go into teaching? They want to teach. They're passionate about teaching. Those are the kind of people we want to be teachers, obviously. But we read a lot of things in the newspaper. I mean, if we go back, certainly in Britain, let's say to the 80s, the 90s
Yeah,
perhaps, but certainly the 80s, it was absolutely routine for not all, but certainly some teachers to hit the children. It was called corporal punishment, which to me is child abuse, but that's just my opinion.
yeah,
But they were allowed to do that. Now I know, and I know just by knowing that some teachers pushed the limits, which even back then would have been, they could have maybe gotten in trouble. I'm talking about kids being punched in the stomach, things of this nature. I mean, if you hear this about Marine Corps boot camp, that's abuse. Well, this is children. This is not the Marines. So nowadays, though, it's gone completely opposite. I've read about female teachers afraid of male students sexually harassing. But bear in mind, we're talking, of course, about high school, maybe before high school too, primary school. But and teachers who are not allowed. And when I say not allowed to touch the children, I mean simply maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a bit extreme, but maybe even a pat on the back. And if a child feels harassed by that when it was just meant to be, well done. I don't know if it's got to that stage, but I have heard and read about things like this. These are not just contrived scenarios I'm making up to try and make a point. We do read about this. Do you think this, before we get into the heart of it about the new government, which obviously is what we're here to talk about, but just giving you some background, do you think that may have an impact on teacher recruitment when we otherwise have really, really enthused people? They wanted to teach. They want to teach. They want to share their knowledge, but they might decide to
yeah.
stay for overseas. In some cases, certainly if it's English as a foreign language. What do you think about that?
So I think that's a great question, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because my colleagues and I would never really discuss that question, but you do hear it, and particularly you hear it from people kind of with experience of education from kind of those earlier decades. Just to kind of put the an extra facts on top of that kind of corporal punishment in the 80s, that actually the abolition of corporal punishment was for state schools, and that in private schools corporal punishment continued. And I don't know the date off the top of my head, but it's surprisingly recent. We're talking like late 90s, possibly even early 2000s. So we're not talking about ages ago, right? We're talking about a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades that corporal punishment has been abolished. And the history of the abolition of corporal punishment, I think, is very interesting. In terms of, are we scared of the violence of our schools, is what I'm kind of hearing you ask in your question. And are we scared of the lack of teacher authority in the classroom?
Yes.
So I trained in what I would describe as a tough school. I also went to a tough school when I was a student, but I trained in a tough school. When I say tough, I mean kind of multi-generational poverty. When this particular council estate was built, it was the biggest council estate in Europe, and the GCSE results the year before I joined were in the bottom 5 in the country. And I'm not talking about bottom 5%. I'm talking about bottom 5 out of 10,000 state-maintained schools. And there was no real respect for teacher authority in that school. And the SLT, they tried to make it a safer environment. They tried to kind of follow kind of whatever behavior things were cool back then. But what I learned in that situation is that really when two people are dealing with one another, and in particular in an educational setting where you as a teacher are trying to convince a child that what you're teaching is worth learning, even though from their own kind of social perspective it's absolutely not. Personal power and personal charisma and kind of emotional intelligence is always going to be worth an enormous amount. And I mean, it's not a nice answer, but I suppose, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that if you develop the emotional intelligence and the skills of a teacher, even in all those schools that you're hearing all those terrible stories about, there will be many, many, many lessons, most lessons, and there'll be teachers who never have behavior issues in their classroom at all. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely scary stories about criminally inclined children that the system should have dealt with much earlier than that, but no more so than there has ever been, right? If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, I've spoken to my father about this. Physical violence, both from teachers and to teachers, was not necessarily rare. In a situation of corporal punishment, you're going to normalize violence, and violence going the other way is going to get more common, not less common. I think schools are definitely safer than they were in the 80s for everybody, and they're definitely safer than when I was at school, even slightly after that. So it's a waffling answer. I've not really got to the heart of what you're saying. I know what you're talking about. The horror stories coming out of France, for example, kind of a completely different level. But I guess my answer is, are schools safe? Yeah, I think they are. I think that is a misplaced fear. I think it's something you have to be aware of in certain communities, and it's something that, of course, you should, like, if you're in a school where, I mean, in some schools, significant percentages, double-digit percentages of the children have at least one parent in jail, for example. And the violence in those communities can be very extreme. But it's a waffling answer. I don't think I've got to the heart of your question, Alex. But I personally think that schools are much safer than they have been in the past.
No, you have got to the heart of it. And we want the level of detail you gave because, again, as I said, I'm sure you'll agree, some of this is quite complex. There are no simple answers sometimes. And as a side, I mean, I teach at university, of course, but I do a lot of outreach. I go into a lot of schools, which I hate labeling, but sometimes we have to do it just for clarity's sake, and what schools that might be called underprivileged. And we're trying to inspire children, be they 6 or 16, and everywhere in between, for a university future. not to sell it as if, it's the hard sell, but simply if you thought about it, then we're going to give you a taste of it. This involves me going to their schools and vice versa. I arrange university visits, and it can be a few mini lectures and a school tour. And I have to say, when I do teach children, and again, however defined from 6 to 16 or 17, there is a certain, it's exciting. It's, you see sometimes
Yes.
that light bulb moment, that spark. Not to say it can't happen with 18-year-olds. I mean, in the States, it's very common to have mature students, much more than here in Britain. And I've had retirees in their 60s tell me, I'm really enjoying this class. But they told me the college experience. And I say college because it was a junior college, which is roughly like a sixth form. But the point is, it's great to see. I mean, a recent visit, a young boy, maybe 11, 12 tops. He's on campus. We just have this brand new engineering building. He could not believe it. He stopped in his tracks, mouth wide open. It's like, wow. And I've kind of felt the same way because I never even set foot in it before. So that may not seem directly relevant, but well, in a way it is, because you get children who really want to learn. You make them excited about a certain subject and make them discover, wow, I didn't know I want to study engineering or linguistics or that subjects which I might not want to study can be accessible. You take them off the shelf. So that's great.
Yeah,
Obviously,
absolutely.
yeah, we're talking about the governments, but before we talk about the new government, so I'm not ignoring the main crux of this, of course not. But again, there's a bit of background. Since 2010, until recently, of course, we have had a Tory government. I'm not trying to get political per se, but it's a fair question, so I'll ask. What do you think the Tories did under the Tory government, either for good or bad, for education? Recruitment certainly is part of that as an offshoot, but just as a broad question, what do they do that you feel was positive and not so good?
Yeah, so absolutely, and of course, politics is always a delicate subject, and I suppose at this point I should say that my politics are not the politics of my organisation, and I would never claim to represent my organisation in those terms. I have only taught under what I will call the Cameron government, which is
Hmm.
of course not, that's of course fallacious because Cameron, well, he was in a coalition in the first term and then didn't even see the second term out because of Brexit. So, but I'm going to call it the Cameron government because I feel like he typified a lot of the things that they did.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's important to locate the center of gravity in the correct place. So if I throw out some words, academization, so the movement of local authority schools, schools maintained by the council, to academies that are in principle much more autonomous, but in practice they're much more centrally run. That was a New Labour and John Major idea. The Tories rolled it out at an incredible scale, but it wasn't their idea. They were just imitating what New Labour had already done. PFI, which people have sort of forgotten about, but is incredibly important, which was the selling off of school buildings in return for new school buildings, but
Mm.
you lose the freehold. And what that means is when Carillion builds you a nice new building, you pay them rent forever, and they also charge you £5 for a light bulb, and then £15 to install it. And I was in a Carillion school, and I watched the effect that had on the school finances, because they went from effectively homeowners to renters. That wasn't a good thing, and of course ended in the collapse, a very embarrassing collapse of Carillion because they'd been fiddling the books. But that wasn't Cameron's idea. Again, that was a New Labour idea, which we could trace to maybe to John Major again if we really wanted to go all the way back. I can go When you go down the line with Tory policies, what you find is nothing. In
Mm.
terms of education, you just find New Labour ideas done badly.
Right.
And so, in terms of whether the Tories were good for education, I don't think it's controversial to say when we're looking at when we see school classroom ceilings collapsing and children being educated in tents, that it
Wow.
wasn't a triumph. Um, but I also think we need to locate the problem in the right place. And I don't think that the policies that the Tories rolled out were necessarily they weren't good policies, but they also weren't their policies. I
That's
think in some ways the problem is they just had no ideas.
right.
And so they thought they could just copy Blair and it'd be fine. But it
Mm,
wasn't fine.
right.
Yeah, so I mean that's a place to start. If
Yeah.
maybe I that was what came to mind. Maybe if we return to your question, maybe how was the your question was how were the Tories for education?
Yeah.
Um,
Because that will, of course, indirectly at least, have a knock-on effect, I would say, with recruitment. Obviously, we're
oh,
going to
absolutely.
have education from two broad perspectives, that of the recipients, most importantly, the children, the students, but obviously of those who are going to be teaching them. And so, I'm wondering if it was an attractive option under that government. Again, we're not talking
Yeah,
people, we're talking about people who are already sold on teaching. There's a lot of people out there who love teaching, but it's the atmosphere, the everyday on the ground level, whether it's personally just do with the school per se, or just the politics of teaching, shall we say, which is not the same as enjoying the process of getting in front of a group, giving a talk, demonstrating, and engaging. That's something very, very different. I've taught in 3 countries, and so give me 3 different cultural perspectives.
yeah, and that cultural perspective is so important, isn't it? And you always have to reflect on that. So I came into teaching through Teach First, which was I don't want to say cultural revolution because it connotes ideas of communist China and Mao, but it was a cultural revolution. So Teach First, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
It's yeah, exactly. It's progeny of Teach for America.
Mhm.
Um, and in the UK, certainly, teaching is a profession, and it's been conducted as a profession, and there's very much kind of a system of mentorship, and you learn the business from old timers who've been there forever. And Teach First was a discontinuity, and again, Teach First, yet another Tory policy, which wasn't really a Tory policy. It started under Gordon Brown, or possibly even before that. But it was again rolled out at scale, and that cultural impact of rather than coming through the PGCE or being trained directly in the school by the school, we had this new thing, which was you're going to be interviewed centrally in the capital. So I remember being interviewed. It was Tower Bridge, and I've never been more intimidated in my life. PwC offices, glass everywhere. I don't think I hadn't been to London as an adult before. I didn't even have a suit, and it was very much this kind of being pumped up to think that you were about to kind of revolutionize everything. And I think what was lost in that was a sense of continuity, and the sense of kind of inducting the profession, inducting its own teachers, because of it was all organized centrally. Um, so I suppose, yeah, the atmosphere. I think Teach First is part of that atmosphere that can't be ignored, but it was kind of part of that overall academization process. Um, I think the big thing, honestly, was retention in terms of the Tory government. So there was a lot of teachers who they were quite clearly actively trying to get out of the profession. Um, well-paid teachers that they didn't think were the type of teachers that, like you said, with the carriers of their cultural message. I think we lost a lot of good teachers and demotivated a lot of other good teachers over the Tory government.
Right.
And I think that's part of the story. Every time we dramatically miss the teacher recruitment numbers, those numbers are kind of plastered all over Schools Week or TES. But how often do we talk about retention? That doesn't get anywhere near as much kind of press.
Oh, good point.
And I think that's if certainly anecdotally, my own personal experience during the Tory years was one of a retention crisis, much more than a recruitment crisis.
I see. This is really interesting. Thank you. This has given us all a very solid background. So what we're going to do now, if you stay with me, Thabo, I won't be long. We're
Yeah.
going to play the commercials again, And then after that, we'll come right back into it to get to the central question of what would you like to see happen under the new government we've just elected, the Labor government, and what do you think they might be able to do? And, obviously it's a single question, which has lots of implied questions, like what wrongs perhaps could they right, or what things might be brought back. So we'll come back soon. Just play the commercials now. So if you can think about what you might want to say to that question, and we'll get right into it after these commercials. Thanks.
Great. Speak to you soon.
Okay.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Okay, Thabo, hello. Thanks again for being with us tonight. And also for those who've joined us, hopefully we'll get some input, some call-ins, and some messages. But as a reminder, we're talking about teacher recruitment. We've talked already, of course, about the challenges and what's been going well and maybe not so well, including with the previous Tory government. So now we're at the present day. We just elected a Labour government, and the question, with a lot of inbuilt questions, of course, and maybe implied questions, is what can maybe the new Labour government do for recruitment, and what would you like it to do? Which, of course, would suggest there are some things it's got to iron out and fix. So over to you, Thabo.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And yeah, that question seems to imply that I have kind of this big program. I wish I did. Torsten Bell at the Resolution Foundation is now a Labour MP, as well as having written a book. And I'm really excited to read that book because I feel like he's going to have a much more coherent idea on all of these things than I do. But I think if I was Keir Starmer, the first thing I would do, or not Keir Starmer, but his education secretary, the first thing I would do is try and stem the bleeding. And yeah, just no own goals too early, and try and get things back under control. I think there's a few things that need looking at fairly urgently from the point of view of workload in schools. And I'm saying this as somebody who left the classroom pretty recently. Our induction period very recently went from so you train to be a teacher, and that if you do the university route, that's a year, and afterwards you have a degree and you have your QTS. But after that, there's an induction period, and that used to be 1 year, and it was called the NQT, and that had a lot of input from mentors, and the school had a lot of things they had to do. That process was extended to 2 years at exactly the moment at which recruitment and retention became such a problem. So in that situation, for example, I read recently that about 50% of maths teachers only teach for 5 years. So you're taking up almost half of your teacher's professional career in those 2 years of induction. And it's incredibly time consuming for the people who have to put it on. It makes the transference between different schools very difficult. So looking at that, I think in detail and thinking about the choke points that's creating, I think is very important. So I train teachers with London Met, and we have to find placements for our students. And once upon a time, that wasn't so difficult. But with schools now creaking, trying to get that 2 year induction done, and then deal with all the transfers because qualified teachers are not, they're not indentured servants. They can move school if they want to, and if they move in the middle of that process, there's an awful lot of paperwork that has to get done. So yeah, the 2 year ECT. I'm not saying get rid of the 2 year ECT, but I am saying look at it as a matter of urgency, because we've just added a ton of workload to a profession which was already in trouble. So I suppose that's one concrete thing. I think, listen, the thing we talked about right at the beginning, the
Yeah.
story.
Mm-hmm.
What's the story? So you kind of told some really inspiring, some inspiring stories, and kind of gave the emotions you felt when you've done outreach in schools. So it's an incredibly enriching job, and you kind of become a bit of a superhero as well. So I was telling you the horror story of me being at my desk before 7 and leaving after 5 every day. But in that day, I had all of these amazing interactions and wrote all of these amazing plans, and really was creatively and emotionally fulfilled in a way that very few jobs can offer.
Yes.
And I remember when I was a trainee teacher, and I remember very vividly, I told you I worked in a difficult school. I remember walking through reception, and there was a policeman there, and there was policemen there fairly frequently because it was that type of school. And I remember the policeman standing up and saying to me, "Good morning, sir." And I don't come from kind of a part of the world where uh, people would necessarily defer to us very often. I remember thinking, I think I was 25. I remember thinking, I'm somebody now,
Mm.
and teaching has that. It has the kind of the purpose and the meaning, and it also has that sense of being somebody. And I guess telling a bit more of that story in a way that connects. If anything is going to get the UK moving in the direction that it could move, it's going to be teachers. And telling that story not just as a soundbite, but as something convincing. That I think that's the moonshot. If you get that story right, I don't see any reason why teaching wouldn't be the most sought after job in this country.
So, with that, if I understand correctly, would that involve, partly at least, making the teaching and how it's presented and how you go about trying to recruit people, make it very concrete? I mean, everyone knows what teaching is, but it sounds like it's about how you, for want of a better word, how you sell it to prospective teachers. So, making it concrete, giving something that's very tangible. These are abstract words, I know, but I'm trying to talk about something that is not abstract, which someone can look at, whether it's a recruiting poster, documentation, or, of course, a TV commercial. And it helps people. I mean, I remember going back to the early 2000s, I think it was, those who can teach. I'm not suggesting a slogan is going to change things dramatically, but we use them for a reason. And that, of course, is addressing that very cynical attitude of those who can't teach, which is true for some, but it's those who
Yeah,
can,
absolutely.
those who can't become all kinds of professions, not just teaching.
Oh, for sure.
Those who can't become accountants too, or whatever the case may be. So, is that what you're getting at? And if so, what
Yeah,
would
it's
you do to do that?
Yeah, so so there's those who can't teach, and then the one I like is those who can't teach the teachers,
Mm.
which would say that I am actually the lowest of the low in this particular hierarchy. Um, I suppose so. I'm reminded of Michael Fallon writes a lot of very good books, and I can't remember I think this was Professional Capital, he wrote this in, but he kind of talks about Singapore's system. So Singapore has 3 tracks for teachers. I can't quite remember all of the details, but for example, one of them is kind of a concept of lead practitioner. So that is for a person who is very deep into the academic side of their subject, and they have a whole track by which these people they move into positions of that academic leadership. And by that I mean they would be the ones who would prepare the students for the Olympiad, or prepare students for Cambridge applications, or
Mm.
do that kind of thing. Um, that's one reason that people get into teaching, because they love their subject. Another reason people get into teaching is that they really like working with young people. And that is perhaps the best reason to get into teaching. But again, carving out something which speaks to those people specifically. One thing that has become less fulfilling in the 10 years that I've been a teacher is there is less and less time to do the things that makes the job meaningful, in the sense of going on trips, organizing extracurricular activities.
Right.
All these things get squeezed. But the problem is, if you got into the business to work with children, all those things are the most important things for you. And it's worse than that, because they've only been reduced in the state sector. Because what does an affluent middle class mother want from her private school experience? She wants all the things that the state sector got rid of. She wants the rowing club. She wants the music lessons. She wants the extracurricular. So we've increasingly got this kind of system of Ruperts and Toms, where the private sector has stuck with all the reasons that make teaching, and the state sector has moved away from that. So I would say, so I suppose I have two answers to your question. I think one is really clarifying that there are many different reasons that people go into teaching, and having a concrete pathway for each of those types of people. And the other thing is making sure that the kind of the enriching experiences, the moments that a teacher lives for, are not squeezed out. English and maths are important, but they're not important at the expense of music lessons.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a separate subject. I'm not asking about it, but it just brings it to mind. That obviously there's some who have very different experiences in the schools they go to, especially if they can afford to go to private schools. And we can get into all issues of meritocracy and such, and if that's really the case. But one question I wanted to ask, and again, keeping it on the main focus of, as I see it, as government influence on teaching recruitment and teacher recruitment. Do you think there was ever a golden age for British teaching? If so, when was that, and what was it? What made it when it was at its healthiest state? And connected with the main focus, was that anything to do with the government who was in power at the time? I know it's a very maybe a left field question, but we can always look back and say, "Oh, things were then." But I know people say, we should bring back the cane. That is sort
Yeah.
of that could be an example of many. Or we should bring back, was it matrons to get the NHS back on its feet?
Oh,
So
right. Yeah.
kind of thing. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, so it's a great question. I think those kind of big questions are really important. So I don't think they're a waste of time at all. There is a conservative pundit called Peter Hitchens who's wrote a book called Revolution Betrayed. So he's a very strong advocate of grammar schools and the
Mhm.
selective grammar school system. Um, I think you could. I think so. He would certainly. I've not read the book, but I'm interested in what data he's gathered, because his basic argument is, if you look at our social mobility in the 70s, we're one of the most socially mobile countries in Europe,
Mhm.
and if you look at it today, we're one of the least. And
Right.
it's not a kind of a marginal shift. We're talking about top two to bottom two.
Wow.
Um, And what he's trying to convince us of is that if we had the grammar schools back, we could go back to those golden ages. And of course, there is that kind of bring back the grammar schools lobby. So my mother went to, so I'm from the north of England, and my mother went to a grammar school, and my father didn't. The reason the grammar, so I suppose let's first of all answer your question. I think you can make the argument that um, the either the grammar schools was that golden age as measured comparatively with the world.
Right.
Not an objective golden age where everything was perfect, but a comparative golden age in which we had something that was slightly better than everybody else. Um, yeah, I think you could argue the grammar schools was that moment, but the problem with the grammar schools, and nobody actually, you've got to ask your parents and your grandparents about the grammar schools, and what you find out is there was 10 grammar schools in the south of England per capita for every one there was in the north of England. So we have these wonderful selective academic schools that take you onto these professional white collar careers. And if you're born in the south of England, you have as many as you want. And if you're born in the north, you don't. And the reason the political consensus around grammar schools faded so quickly, and there was nobody left to defend them, wasn't a kind of a left versus right problem. It was a fact that the constituency served by the grammar schools was not big enough. They would have had to have spent the money to expanded that system into the north in the way it should have been expanded into the north. And rather than spend the money, what you can do is you can go, oh, we'll scrap the whole system and call it equality. And in that, you lose a lot of capital, you lose a lot of ways of doing things. And so, yeah, I think if there was a moment of a golden age, it was probably the grammar school. So kind of, I'm talking about the post-war Education Act with the tripartite system. It was probably that moment. But the problem with it was, again, it was not equally distributed, and it bred bitterness, and that's what eventually undid it.
I see. Okay.
And
Because
my father is still bitter,
ah,
and if my mother and my father were to sit all the diagnostic tests that you'd imagine would get you into one of these schools, and my mother was to do the same, my father would absolutely score way, way, way higher than my mother. But again, my mother was in the correct postcode.
right, right.
So it just wasn't fair. I think it probably was a very good system for the people it worked for.
Right. That's a very succinct way to put it, and I don't think it's oversimplifying either. I think it's in many ways hitting one of the many nails on the head. So there might be some input to come, again, call-ins or people typing messages, and there might not. But while we're still on the air, do you think you can give maybe a summary? I don't mean in terms of how much time you spent on it, but a summary, well, more like a conclusion. So not so much as
Yeah.
wrapping up what you've said, but what do you think are the main takeaways? Going forward. I mean, I know you already addressed this in large part, but I'll make it this way. If you were the education secretary, I mean, you've talked about what you want the current education secretary to do, but you're on the ground level. I mean, you're on the ground, boots on the ground, and the grassroots level, and so am I. But again, when people talk about teaching, it's I'm at university and I don't teach children. As I said, when I do my outreach, it's a really, really wonderful experience. You just don't get as much in university, but it's still there. That, as I said, that light bulb moment, that connection where students, for me, once I went into a high school and I talked about what I do. I'm a linguist, and we talked about different accents and how, not for politically correct reasons, but for linguistically correct reasons, how the hell can a phoneme, a unit of sound, dictate your intelligence or lack thereof, or your friendliness or lack thereof?
Absolutely.
Is Bath really inherently more, fill in the blank, sexy, educated, trustworthy than Bath?
Yeah.
And because New Yorkers don't pronounce their R's and say "quack the qua," and but not too far up in the Northeast, neither do New Englanders, or certainly in Boston. In Boston, it sounds educated. In New York, it sounds like you're a gangster. And I had this some students, man, they just really, really caught on. Of course, it's great when they have that spark for linguistics, but that's what I do. But I'm not wedded to linguistics. If they can teach me about how water expands at 3 degrees, well, that's fascinating. And I can visualize that in my ice cube tray. It's great. So yeah, even now I'm getting excited. There's all kinds of things. So what would you do? What do you think if I say the 3 things that you would do?
3 things I would do as education secretary. Now, the problem with so first of all, I loved everything you said. I don't put an R in Bath, and neither do 600 million native speakers of English. It's just a small group of people in the Southeast that do. So I'm absolutely with you there. What would I do? So the problem with it being the education secretary is you might just be the education secretary for 4 years, and we've been suffering these kind of swings. Let me throw you a curveball. Since this is a radio show, and we're trying to be at least a little bit entertaining. Um, I think the constitutional, and you asked me for concrete nitty gritty things,
Hmm.
but you asked me to deliver those from within the political framework. And I'm going to question that paradigm a little bit. Once upon a time, if you and again, I'm going to tell another little bit of history, but we used to have these things called Her Majesty's Inspectors,
Okay.
and instead of Ofsted, we had Her Majesty's Inspectorate. So we
Hmm.
still have His Majesty's Inspectors, but instead of His Majesty's Inspectorate, now we have Ofsted. And I think for those people who understand the Constitution of England, the move from education being primarily associated with the crown, symbols of continuity and statehood, to be associated with the government, symbols of power and executive, I think is a really bad one. And I think we need to not be thinking about education as a political football. So one thing I would really try and do is to try and find some other vehicle other than Parliament to safeguard the continuity of our traditions.
Hmm.
And that, again, that's pretty out there. But like I said, it's very concrete. So Ofsted has existed for less time than I've existed. It's about 30 years old. Um, and people are talking, of course, about abolishing Ofsted, and I think that's probably going to happen sooner rather than later. But I think that we need to really reflect on why we need to abolish Ofsted. We need to abolish Ofsted because, first of all, it's it's quite toxic. But second of all, because its constitutional form is the wrong form. We need continuity, and
Hmm.
Ofsted is the very symbol of wild swings and wild policy swings. So I suppose, yeah, that's a big answer. Um, you could take for just if you want to take just one thing from it, reform Ofsted, change it into something which might potentially safeguard the traditions of teaching rather than subject them to scrutiny and wild swings. Secondly, I would think very carefully um, about demographics and make sure that we are looking at where we're going to be in 10, 15 years' time, because our demographics are changing a lot, and babies are being born in different parts of the country, and the worst thing we could do is to just go all guns blazing, recruit loads of teachers without really thinking 10, 15 years out. So yeah, not getting caught out by having lots of teachers in the wrong place at the wrong time. And finally, I would think about the peer review system. So I would think about the way we encourage teachers to scrutinize and reflect on themselves,
Hmm.
because no one can tell me how to do my job better. I have got, or certainly nobody without more classroom hours in computer science and maths can tell me how to teach maths and computer science better. This isn't a brag. In some ways, it's a deficiency, because where does my feedback come from? So I was an examiner this year, and that was incredible feedback, because that's a room of teachers all examining the same qualifications. There is a certain degree of hierarchy, but in general, it is a debate. It's two individuals um, thrashing it out over what an answer means and what a potential rubric could be. And Alex, you work in the academy as well. You're at Manchester, aren't you?
Yeah.
So you'll appreciate that if we are at the cutting edge, we are kind of beyond that top-down scrutiny. And the way the academy deals with it is they do peer review. And teaching's just the same. That you can't do it from the top down. And the reason is, if you can do it from the top down, it means your teachers aren't any good.
Right. Interesting. And I like the point you made. Just to come back to that, with I think you said self-review, self-reflection. I'm thinking specifically, this might have been what you were referring to. I'm thinking of teacher training. I mean, in a way, can you teach someone how to teach? I don't think you can. You can teach them the concrete things, the lesson plans and timetabling. And yes, your voice is a bit, slow down a bit, this kind of thing. But not you, of course. I'm just saying. I'm thinking of this.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, I
Yeah.
always need to slow down. No matter, I can be told that 100 times, it's still true.
But we can't teach necessarily how to teach. At least I don't think so. But then I think it can be a tug of war between the mentor and the mentee. And this is obviously another topic for another show. But it's good that from one topic we can get so many other topics because one thing leads to another. And I think yourself, me, and hopefully maybe everyone on this who's joined us can talk about teaching or certain aspects of it forever because there's a lot to talk about. In this case, we've talked about, just to wrap things up here, and thank you again, Thabo, for your time. We've talked about what the current Labour government might be able to do for teacher recruitment. We've talked about what the challenges are for teacher recruitment, but in some ways, what are the strengths too? So, Thabo, I thank you so much again for coming on the show. I think we just got to the time, and that's great. Something very, very informative. And so, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And what we're going to do is just round everything out and go out with a little jingle. So thank you again, Thabo. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Alex. You too.
Bye.
Nice to catch up. Bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio. You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.